Hi class, this is Professor Cook with the third and final part of audio and screen capture for Chapter 9 on race and ethnicity. I'm going to jump right in and talk about these concepts a little bit and then get into explaining the difference between individual and institutional racism. So as we said earlier, racism is believing that one's own group is superior to other groups. Prejudice is an attitude. So we all have prejudice, right, of some kind or another. It's whether or not we sort of act on that prejudice that makes something discrimination. So prejudices come from, we could also call these biases or bias. They come from just living in a society. So there are, and our own individual experiences. So prejudice, an attitude, positive or negative, toward people because of their group membership. And I should add, it's their perceived group membership. So I can kind of misunderstand someone's group and still have prejudice toward them. Okay. Stereotype is an oversimplified or exaggerated generalization about a whole category of people. So I think this is different from a microaggression. But they sort of form the basis for some of those microaggressions we talked about in the last section. Ethnocentrism is sort of the ethnicity version of racism, where it's belief that your own culture, society is superior. And then scapegoats, we talked about this, I think earlier before we moved to the online format, is when we construct as a society or we blame groups of people for their own problems or for other problems in society. So in the political arena, I think you can definitely see a lot of scapegoating of immigrants, right? Immigrants as being a drain on the system, things like that. That's scapegoating. And I think right now, unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of scapegoating of people of Asian ancestry or are assumed to have Asian ancestry about the current coronavirus situation. Okay, so this is where we want to kind of slow down and really explain these concepts clearly. So prejudice, as I said, is an attitude. Discrimination is an action. So I can have prejudice but not take action on that. Okay, so I can have prejudice but not discriminate. And that's going to be an important distinction in a minute here. So discrimination is an action that treats people unequally or unfairly because of their group membership. Individual discrimination is harmful action based on a one-to-one basis or a one-to-one interaction. So individual discrimination are things like, I refuse to serve people of LGBT identity, okay? Something like that. Institutional discrimination is unequal treatment due to the everyday operations of society. So it has to happen, institutional has to happen at the level of a higher up level than a one-to-one basis. There has to be a bigger pattern of discrimination for it to be institutional. So an example of institutional discrimination with respect to people who identify as LGBTQ would be prior to having same-sex marriage legalized nationwide, the idea that only opposite-sex couples could legally be married was a kind of institutional discrimination because there's all kinds of benefits associated with marriage as a status that were unavailable to people of a specific identity. Okay, so individual discrimination is, again, if I refuse to bake a cake for someone or serve, or I was just, crappy to someone because of their identity. Institutional is at the level of a whole society or an entire sector of society. Okay, so the way to maybe make this a little more clear with another example is to consider the criminal justice system. Okay, the criminal justice system. So if you think about stereotypes in our society about people of certain identities being more prone to crime or something like that, which is not true, this might help. So the fact that we have a disproportionate number of men who identify as African American or Black or Latino in prison is institutional discrimination. Okay? Disproportionate numbers of Black and brown men incarcerated is institutional discrimination. One individual calling the police on people who they're reading as Black trying to have a barbecue in the park is individual discrimination. You may have heard about Barbecue Becky or those sorts of instances. Okay, that's individual. Where this gets tricky is situations like Black Lives Matter, right? Like the disproportionate shooting and killing of Black unarmed youth by other law enforcement and private citizens. Okay, so it sort of transcends that line from individual to institutional discrimination, right? Because we see those patterns reflected in our criminal justice system. Okay. So hopefully that wasn't confusing. We'll kind of try to get that more more specifically, but this little mini quiz might help. Okay. So your options here, again, the answers are in the notes section, are institutional discrimination, individual discrimination, or stereotypes or scapegoating, etc. So you can go ahead and test yourself here. I just want to point out number 2, okay, the bank being less likely to give home loans to Latinos, that is institutional discrimination, okay? Individual people at the bank may be completely fine and want to give loans to people who are Latino, but something about the bank's policy, something about how they've decided to give loans or not, is creating a disparity. Okay. Number 3 is about one person's attitudes and their actions based on those people. So that would be individual. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, send me a message or give me a call. So this graph I just sort of liked because it kind of gets at these different levels of how we have sort of cultural stereotypes existing right out there. Whether or not I believe them or not, we're usually exposed to them. So there's stereotypes about gender, stereotypes about race, stereotypes about ethnicities, religions, etc. And then prejudice is at the level at which I decide, how do I feel about this person based on their membership? Like, do I fundamentally distrust men or something like that? What are my attitudes toward them? And then discrimination would be how I act, okay? So a stereotype might be something like men are aggressive, right? And they're aggressive and they're sort of domineering, right? And an attitude is, how do I decide about that? If I'm personally afraid of men because of that stereotype I've been exposed to, and maybe, frankly, some of my personal experiences with people who are men or male. And then the behavior would be if I am unnecessarily harsh on male students or something like that, or if I treat them differently in some way, in an unequitable way, than I would students who are not men. Hopefully that makes some sense. Okay, I want to spend a little time on this slide. This is presented slightly differently in your text. The labels that Conley uses are just a little bit different, but it's the same concept. So this comes from Robert Merton. And this is where it's really important to understand the difference between prejudice and discrimination. I want you to make sure you very clearly understand this, because on the final exam, I will give you examples and ask you, where does this person fit based on the little scenario I shared with you into this 2x2 table, excuse me. So the first question to ask is, the person prejudiced? That's on the left side there. And do they discriminate? Okay, so if the person is prejudiced, yes, and they discriminate, Merton calls them a consistent bigot. Consistent bigot. So the person is prejudiced and they discriminate. So we might, you know what, I'm going to do examples after I finish talking about all these, okay? Is the person prejudiced? Yes, but they don't discriminate. They are what Merton called a timid bigot. So they are prejudiced, but they don't discriminate. Maybe because of sanctions they would face, like repercussions, or maybe they would lose their job or have some kind of consequence to their actions. So they don't discriminate. Okay, is the person prejudiced? No. Let's go to the left side in the bottom quadrant there. Do they discriminate? Yes. Merton called that person a fair weather liberal, a non-prejudiced person who discriminates. And finally, is the person prejudiced? No. Do they discriminate? No. Merton called them a consistent liberal, a non-prejudiced person who does not discriminate. I want to add here, when Merton uses the terms liberal, he's not talking about politics like Democrat, Republican, liberal, or conservative. He's using that in a different way as the opposite of bigot to some extent. Okay, so just to be clear about that. So let me give you a couple of examples. Okay, a consistent bigot would be someone like Kim Davis in Kentucky, who had personal beliefs about the fact that same-sex couples should not be allowed to get married. And normally this may not affect what she did, but she was a clerk of court, so she had to issue marriage licenses, right? So she had those attitudes and refused to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples, even when it was the law, okay? So that would be a consistent bigot. If she was prejudiced, yes, but she still did her job and issued the marriage licenses, she would be what? A timid bigot, right? Per this chart, okay? Where it gets tricky too is this, are they prejudiced and do they discriminate? The fair weather liberal, right? This is a very insidious way that racism and discrimination persists, even when we have cultural, attitudinal, and societal change to try to, dismantle these systems of oppression. To some extent, Merton's typology helps us understand why that continues. So a fair weather liberal, is tricky because they are a non-prejudiced person, but somehow they discriminate, either due to pressure from others or because of the law. The law itself could be prejudiced and discriminatory. So an example of this can be seen in the criminal justice system. In the case of drug laws and mandatory minimum sentencing for crack versus powder cocaine in the 1980s and 90s, you would often have judges who were forced by the law to impose a much harsher sentence for possession of crack versus powder cocaine. Same drug, same amount of the drug, but the sentencing for crack was much stricter by law. So judges may not have wanted to, right? They may not have been prejudiced against people who use crack, which, you guessed it, are disproportionately lower income and people of color versus people who use powder cocaine, which, you guessed it, are disproportionately wealthier and white, right? The judge may not have wanted to discriminate between those two groups, but because of the way the law is structured, they were forced to. So this is how you get a war on drugs translating into the highest rate of incarceration in the United States. But we're going to come back to that in Chapter 6. Okay, and then a consistent liberal, a non-prejudiced person who does not discriminate. So I think that's fairly straightforward. Okay. Couple more concepts here. Interracial marriage is increasing. Prior to 1967, this was still illegal in some parts of the United States. So President Obama famously said that when he was born, his parents' marriage was technically illegal in some parts of the U.S. because his mom was white and his dad was African. So this is an increasing, racial ethnic intermarriages are increasing, and they're now 10% of all married couples, and more Americans identify as biracial or multiracial, and finally, you can indicate that on the census. So this is a growing, diverse group. The term miscegenation is just a word that means mixing of people of different races, and mixing here means having children or having offspring. So it has a negative connotation. The more positive term would be interracial marriage, but the laws that were struck down finally in 1967 by the U.S. Supreme Court's decision on Loving versus the state of Virginia were called anti-miscegenation laws, or no mixing laws. Okay, so remember that date, 1967. Remember the term. And thank you. And I will check in with you soon.